More than 20,000 Russians have been arrested protesting the war. That's a lot in a country that practices terror and bans all independent thought and action, even music. But that's not where the majority of Russians are. Most Russians have retreated into a daze of denial. They are hiding, they are silent, they're in a parallel reality in which they half pretend that everything is normal. They're showing an unbelievable lack of empathy for what's going on in Ukraine, and they're even oblivious about their own future, which they have delegated to a leader who says that their next-door neighbor country doesn't exist, isn't real, and needs to be invaded in a defensive and existential war against the West. Understanding where the Russian people are is also about our future. We don't know how this ends for us. We don't even know what our odds of surviving this are, because we are dealing with a modern-day Tsar Nicholas I with nuclear weapons. For the Russian people, freedom is really important, but it also doesn't exist. To help us understand that more, I have dug out this Facebook note from political commentator Gleb Pavlovsky. Pavlovsky says the inhabitant doesn't protest not because they're afraid, but because they are already free. Demobilization is the freedom that is sufficient for them. To get to the bottom of what Pavlovsky is saying, we need to say something about freedom as a universal value. Freedom as a value that's dear to you because you are human. I've been thinking about freedom for a quarter of a century. My doctorate work was on it. I'm writing a book about it. It's hard to say something simple about freedom, but we're going to try. Freedom comes out of the experience of frustration, the feeling of resentment in the face of being put in somebody else's power. Russians feel this. They are fiercely protective of their freedom, but they don't understand freedom as a political idea. So what's the difference? Let's help ourselves to an example from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Émile, 1762. And Rousseau says, look, there's a difference between being locked in your house by a snowstorm and being locked in your house by a person. And let's take Jean-Jacques' example further. Imagine that it's now the police or the government that have locked you in your house. Now this is politics, because you're no longer frustrated that the snowstorm has locked you in or that some person has locked you in. You're now frustrated because you've been locked in by a political power. And now your question is not, do I feel frustrated about being locked in? Your question is now, does the political power that's locked me in have the authority to do this? Is it legitimate? Is it justified? Instead of being frustrated, you are exploring whether you have a complaint that goes beyond, I don't like this. It's now, I don't like this, plus I have a claim which political institutions should recognize. You've now entered politics. To clarify this even more, let's look at it the other way around. Imagine you're now not the victim, but the culprit. Imagine you've decided to make a broth out of your next door neighbor and you've been stopped by the police. You are obstructed in your capacity to act, but your political freedom is not restricted. Being able to boil your neighbor is not a political freedom, because as soon as you try to justify the freedom to boil your neighbor in terms of rights or values that a society should respect, you fast run out of anything to say in your defense. I want to tell you a story. When I was visiting Russia in the 90s and in the early noughties from the West, there was a period when very wealthy Russians were allowed to buy sirens and number plates for their cars that allowed them to partly bypass the laws of the road, including being stopped by the police for speeding. And when Russians, ordinary Russians, were on the wrong end of this, when some rich person with a siren was doing an illegal U-turn and blocking off 6 lanes of traffic, ordinary Russians felt frustrated about this. But on the whole, they didn't feel this is unjust, this is unfair, this is inequitable, that this rich idiot is allowed to do this. They felt frustrated. They felt frustrated that they weren't allowed to get home on time because this was happening in front of them. But they didn't think it was unjust, and some of them would have thought, well, look, if I had that money, I'd get these gadgets and I'd be able to do whatever I want on the road. So Russian citizens were frustrated by this, but they didn't respond to the obstacle as citizens. They didn't respond to the obstacle as citizens who live in a society which has a shared conversation about principles of fairness and justice. They weren't thinking about their freedom and their freedom being restricted as a political value. They were not being citizens. You might say, doesn't this mean that Russians are politically immature? Yeah, but there are two important buts. The first but is that we shouldn't condescend too much, because we in the West are becoming a bit politically mature too. We have citizens en masse opting out of politics. And one of the things we've got to make sure is that we don't get anywhere near the level of depoliticization that Russians have got to. And that's part of the reason for having the conversation we are having on this channel. The second but is really fascinating and important. Lacking a three-dimensional sense of freedom as a political value is a passive state. But in the case of Russians, it's not just a passive state. It's also a kind of rebellion. It's not a rebellion that's political. It's a rebellion not in politics, but against politics. But we shouldn't think of Russia as being passive on an historical scale. Russia is one of the spiritual homes of anarchism, and Russian anarchism has proved influential all over the world. So when we see compliance with Putin in Russia, it's also a kind of rebellion, but it's not rebellion against Putin, it's rebellion against politics. The background to this rebellious passivity is that it was hard for Russians under the Soviet period, and to some extent after, to carve out an existence and a personal life out of which you successfully kept the intrusions of the state. As understandable as this position of passive rebellion might be, it's as dangerous as anything we can imagine. Because time and time again, history teaches us that when we turn away from politics, that doesn't mean that politics is going to turn away from us. And the danger here isn't just for Russia or for Ukraine, it's for all of us. Here is Russian political philosopher and sociologist Greg Yudin.
Do you think we're headed for a nuclear attack?
Yeah, that's what I think.
That's stunning.
Well, this is exactly what I'm trying to convey. I think that many people in the West are still looking at this as a local conflict between two post-Soviet countries. Vladimir Putin is not waging a war against Ukraine. He doesn't even believe in the existence of Ukraine. You cannot wage a war against someone who doesn't exist. And he genuinely doesn't believe in the existence of Ukraine and Ukrainians. He's waging a war against NATO, against the so-called West, against the Americans. And she's completely certain that the West is weak, the West is coward, and is not going to protect any country in Eastern Europe, including Ukraine or Poland, when it is threatened with nuclear arms.
The problem the Russian people have is they don't have a red line when they raise their hand and say, no, no more. I'm not going to stand for this. And that means that it's to some degree up to the gods how far Russia spirals into fascism and what the international consequences of this are. This whole story can go in two ways. The first positive way is that suddenly a red line appears for ordinary Russians in virtue of some massive disturbance of their everyday life. This might be partial mass mobilization for the war in Ukraine. It could be a small-scale nuclear strike on a NATO installation. It could be Putin getting very ill such that it's clear that Russians now need to see a future beyond him. The negative scenario is that Russians are too depoliticized to notice how depoliticized they are at this crucial moment in their history. On this scenario, the Russian people are like a frog in boiling water, incrementally shifting from living in an authoritarian to living in a totalitarian state. The terrifying place we could land is that the first time the Russian people become citizens, they become fascist citizens. And to understand more about that, and sadly this is a process that's already begun, watch this video next.